It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to the 7th Annual William C. Moran Address. First thing I want to do before we get started is recognize some special guests in attendance this afternoon, beginning with the founding president of Francis Marion University, Dr. Doug Smith. Doug. And I also want to recognize President Fred Carter, the president of Francis Marion University. And special thanks to John Tuttle, who does the behind-the-scenes work that makes this event possible every spring. So, John, thank you. And now a word about Dr. William C. Moran, for whom this event is named, and of course it's an event that honors Dr. Moran and his long service as an educator. He was, I believe, for 14 years, the Vice President of Academic Affairs at Francis Marion University before he went on to become President of Lander University. Dr. Moran actually was Vice President of Academic Affairs when I came to FMU in 1989, so in a sense, he hired me. He left soon thereafter. I hope there was no cause and effect involved. But I can tell you that Bill Moran was not only greatly respected on this campus, but also held regarded with great affection by the faculty. And we are delighted to have with us this afternoon members of the Moran family in attendance with us, Margaret Moran and Thomas Moran, and I believe Bill's daughter-in-law is, I'm sorry, yes, okay. All right. Well, as usual, I managed to mess that up. I apologize for that. But we are delighted to have members of the Moran family with us this afternoon. Now, today's Moran Address will be presented by our friend and colleague, Dr. Eileen Kirley-Tallon. To most of us in this room, Eileen really, as they say, needs no introduction. But for some of the newcomers out there, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Eileen and about her career at Francis Marion University. Let me preface this by saying that, you know, Eileen is one of those faculty members who was there from the early days on and built this university into the great institution that it's become. She retires in July after 39 years of service to FMU. The honors she has received include being named Distinguished Professor in 1994. She was also appointed the John Munro Johnson Holliday Professor of Political Science in 1988. She's a member of several honor societies, including Phi Kappa Phi, of which she served as president, and Pi Sigma Alpha. In 1988, she participated as Francis Marion's representative in a 6-week Fulbright Hays seminar in several different Chinese venues, and the subject of that seminar was modernization and social change in China. In 1993, she was granted one of the first 2 sabbatical leaves awarded at FMU, and in 2005, she received another sabbatical. She earned her baccalaureate degree in political science from the University of Cincinnati and her Master of Arts from the University of Pittsburgh. In 1974, while completing her doctorate at the University of Pittsburgh, she was invited to join the faculty at Francis Marion College, as it was then called. Since then, she has taught courses in U.S. government, Introduction to Political Science, Political Theory, Comparative Government, Political Movements and Revolutions, and many other courses in our political science curriculum. She's also regularly taught courses for the honors program. Dr. Kirley-Tallon has served as chair of the Department of Political Science, History, and Geography. Yes, we actually had such a combination at one time. And she's served in many capacities on departmental and institutional committees. She's one of her most noteworthy accomplishments was her service as director of the self-study for reaccreditation back in 1985, 1987. I think that may have been the second SACS review that we went through, okay. Throughout her career, Dr. Kirley-Tallon has served her community and her profession in a variety of ways. She's given many scholarly presentations and presented papers to professional organizations, including the South Carolina Political Science Association, the Southern Political Science Association, the Association for Asian Studies, and the American Political Science Association. Dr. Kirley-Tallon lives in Florence with her husband, Tom, who is here today. And I think there are other members of the family here as well, and we certainly welcome them to this afternoon's presentation. So, her address this afternoon is entitled, All You Need Is Love. Join me now in welcoming to the lectern Dr. Eileen Kirley-Tallon.
Thank you, and good afternoon. When I was in the later years of grade school and the early years of high school, I discovered what I love, music and politics. I spent hours listening to the radio and playing records of the popular music of the times. I went crazy over the Beatles, but was never much of an Elvis fan, though that changed later when I began to appreciate how good his music was. I went to concerts and saw groups like the Four Seasons, the Supremes, the Rolling Stones, and the Beatles perform some of my favorite music. In high school, I was introduced to opera by my mother and fell in love with that as well. The Cincinnati Summer Opera performed at an open-air venue at the Cincinnati Zoo, so going to the opera usually meant getting very hot, and also, because Seal Island was right next door, listening to the barking of the seals during the most beautiful of arias. Eventually, I came to like country music and bluegrass, so today I can say that I enjoy almost all kinds of music. But what eventually led me to Francis Marion was my love of politics. I credit Walter Cronkite with helping to ignite that love. I watched a program called The 20th Century, which he narrated, and became fascinated with political history. I remember becoming especially interested in Hitler and the Nazis, and Stalin and the Soviet communists. Fascist and communist ideology intrigued me, even though the horrors committed in the name of these ideologies appalled and sickened me. I learned about World War II and became interested in the causes of war. I learned about the communist revolution in China and became interested in political revolutions, what causes them, who leads them, why they succeed, and why, if they fail, history tends to call them rebellions. Words truly are not politically neutral. Before I finished high school, I knew that my interest in political history was an interest in anything and everything connected with government and politics, and that I would major in political science in college. In college, I discovered that my favorite courses were the ones in political philosophy and comparative politics. I was fascinated by philosophers like Machiavelli and Hobbes, and by Indian politics and political history, and loved the courses that dealt with revolutionary movements. In graduate school, my interests broadened further. I became an expert on Marxian political theory and developed a keen interest in those who would follow Marx and add to the body of Marxist thought. I read many of the works of Lenin and Mao, and also Stalin, pardon me. Lenin and Mao's works were interesting and insightful, but Stalin's works were turgid, uninspiring, and awful. By my third year of graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh, I was asked to teach an upper division course on the political theory of Marxism. It was a challenge, but I was completely exhilarated. In graduate school, I also became interested in moral philosophy and did my third field for the PhD in moral philosophy, which was a great fit with my first field of political philosophy. When I arrived at Francis Marion in the fall of 1974, there were only 2 political scientists here. I therefore had to develop many courses I had never taught before and that were outside my particular fields of expertise. Of course, I taught U.S. government, but I also taught upper division courses in methodology, American political parties, and, well, whatever the program needed to be taught. I developed a real interest in Western European politics, adding that to my repertoire of teaching and research in South Asian, Soviet, and Chinese politics. I also became interested in and developed a course in women in politics. The course had cultural, historical, philosophical, electoral, and legal aspects to it, and so ignited my interest in yet another area of government and politics. Then, during my sabbatical in 2005, I researched the European Union, which had become an important part of my course in Western European politics. Clearly, Francis Marion has enabled me to pursue my love of government and politics, and to try to pass that love on to students. Whether I have done that, I cannot say for sure, but I know from course evaluation comments that some of my students have obviously recognized my passion for my field. A recent favorite comes from fall 2012. It reads, quote, "I must admit, your class was my favorite this semester. You are so excited, and you know what you were talking about." End of quote. I have always hoped that my enthusiasm and passion for politics would ignite the same feelings in my students, and at least for some of them, I think it has. In recent years, I have become quite interested in electoral systems in democracies and their effects on election results and political systems. The electoral system used to elect the members of the House of Commons in the United Kingdom has been of great interest to me, and so I would like to tell you a bit about that system and the effect it has on British politics. The system goes by several different names. The British call it the first past the post system, but I usually refer to it as single-member district with plurality election. How it works is fairly simple, and no one needs a degree in politics to understand it. The United Kingdom is divided into electoral districts, each of which is roughly equal in population. The number of districts is equal to the number of seats in the House of Commons, and the people in each district elect a single member to the House of Commons. The candidate with the most votes in each district, a plurality, wins the district seat. Because there are usually 3 to 5 candidates running in each district, it is often the case that the winning candidate wins the seat in Commons with a minority of the votes in the district. This electoral system gives a clear advantage to the larger parties in the UK, that is, the ones with the most supporters. Since 1945, the 2 largest parties have been the Conservative and Labour parties. A smaller party, the Liberal Democrats, has its supporters spread throughout the UK in many districts. The result is that the Liberal Democratic candidate seldom comes in first in the balloting in many districts, and therefore the Liberal Democratic Party receives far fewer district seats than its proportion of the people's votes would suggest. The first past the post system is not in any way proportional because a party's percentage of the popular vote is not reflected by the percentage of seats it receives in the House of Commons. Though I could bore you with reams of data from general elections in Britain for the last 100 years, some data from the 2010 election results, the most recent general election, will demonstrate this point. In that year, the Conservative Party received 36% of the vote, but won 47% of the seats. In similar fashion, Labor won 29% of the popular vote and received 40% of the seats. Contrast those numbers with the results for the poor Liberal Democratic Party, which garnered 23% of the vote nationwide, but received only 9% of the seats in the House of Commons. Their strength in Commons is in no way proportional to their support among the voters. Electoral systems are not politically neutral in democracies and will operate in ways that advantage some parties and disadvantage others. And that means the dynamics of the political system are affected as well, since the parties which do well in elections will control the system's direction by establishing their ideas as national policy. Neither of the major parties in the UK won a majority of the seats in Commons in the 2010 general election. This has not happened in a while. Since 1945, either the Conservatives or Laborites have won a majority of the seats in most elections. That's what brought the Liberal Democratic Party into the spotlight. Since neither of the larger parties had a majority, one of those parties would need the votes of the Liberal Democrats to form a coalition government and elect their leader as prime minister. In 2010, extensive negotiations took place between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democratic Party. A majority coalition was formed, and the Conservative leader, David Cameron, was elected prime minister. One of the negotiating points involved in the electoral negotiations was the electoral system itself. For some time, the Liberal Democrats had advocated changing the first-past-the-post system to a system of proportional representation. There are many varieties of this system, but the basic idea was that the percentage of votes received for each party would be proportional to the percentage of seats won in the House of Commons. Such a system would, of course, be great for the Liberal Democrats. Unfortunately for them, the Conservative Party was completely opposed to such a change. But as a concession during the coalition negotiations, agreed to hold a national referendum on the question of changing the first-past-the-post system to an alternative vote system. This change would help the Liberal Democrats win more seats and make the system more proportional. The results of the referendum would be binding, so if the people voted yes, the electoral system would be changed for the next general election in 2015. The alternative vote system would retain the single-member district character of the current electoral system, but it would alter what people do in the voting booth and how the votes are counted. Each voter would rank the candidates in order of preference. The voter would put a 1 by his first choice, a 2 by his second choice, and so on until he no longer wanted to express a preference. If a candidate received a majority of the first choice votes, he would be elected. If no candidate received a majority, the candidate with the fewest first choice votes would be eliminated, and the second choice votes on that candidate's ballots would be redistributed. That process would continue until one candidate had a majority of the votes and was elected. The Conservative Party was as good as its word, and the House of Commons passed a law providing for the referendum. It was held May 5th, 2011, and the results were decisive. The change was rejected by 68% of the voters. Turnout in the referendum was only 42%, but it exceeded the minimum turnout of 40% required to make the results valid. Most voters seem to want the status quo to remain, which does not surprise me much, since most of them are supporters of either the Conservative or Labor parties, both of which do so well using the first-past-the-post system. As an aside, The U.S. uses the single-member district with plurality election system to elect members of the House of Representatives. But since we have a two-party system in which only a Democratic or a Republican candidate has a realistic chance of winning, the winning candidate in most districts wins with a majority of the vote. The U.S. is not immune to parties tinkering with electoral systems if they feel they can gain some kind of advantage. In the aftermath of the 2012 U.S. presidential election, there have been rumblings about changing in some states the method of allocating electors in the Electoral College. The Constitution leaves it up to the states to decide how each state's electors are chosen and how electoral votes are allocated. Currently, all 50 states allow voters to choose electors. But in 48 of the 50 states, the exceptions are Maine and Nebraska, the state's electors are determined by a winner-take-all system. In states with a winner-take-all system, the candidate who wins the popular vote would win all the electoral votes. So, a candidate with 55% of the electoral votes, of the popular votes, would win all the electoral votes, and the candidate with 45% would win none. This means in practice that a close popular vote can end up looking like a landslide or near landslide in the Electoral College. This was the case in the 2012 presidential election. The popular vote was much closer than the electoral vote. Barack Obama received 51% of the popular vote, but won 62% of the electoral vote. Mitt Romney won 47% of the popular vote, but received only 38% of the electoral vote. Subsequent to the election, some Republican leaders in states that went to Obama began talking about changing the method of allocating electoral votes to a system similar to that used in Maine and Nebraska. These states include Virginia, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, all of which have Republican governors and Republican-dominated legislatures. Alan Abramowitz, a political science professor at Emory University, calculated that if the system of allocating electoral votes to the winners of House districts in all states had been used in the 2012 election, the outcome of the election would have been different. Romney would have won 276 electoral votes, 6 more than the 270 needed to win, and Obama would have won only 262. Professor Abramowitz is quite opposed to such a change, as are some Democrats who have said that since Republicans couldn't win the election, they want to change the Electoral College. But Democrats in the past have proposed changes to the Electoral College when they found themselves disadvantaged. Whether in the UK or in the US, electoral systems are not politically neutral, and parties will always want to change systems to gain an advantage. This is nothing new in democratic political systems, and both parties in the US seem just a tad shrill when they accuse each other of trying to destroy democracy by altering the Electoral College. In recent years, I have taken an interest in elections in the European Union, or more precisely, the lack of people's interest in elections to the European Parliament. The European Union is an international organization, but it is not like other international organizations. In the EU, institutions make decisions that bind member countries and their citizens. To join the EU, a country must agree to treaties, which form the foundational law of the Union and which require that the government of each member country cede some sovereignty to the Union institutions. In other words, the Union makes the law, and the member countries have to follow it. This loss of sovereignty has been accepted because of the benefits that have come from the economic integration that the Union has created. At first, the Union institutions which made law and established policies, were not directly elected by the citizens of the member countries. The executive officials of the member countries proposed and adopted the policies of the Union, but the people had no direct input into these decisions. There was a European Parliament, but it was composed of members appointed by member governments and did not have any real decision-making power. Then, in 1979, direct election to the Parliament was approved by the European Union. At first, voters participated in large numbers to elect their country's members of the European Parliament, known as MEPs. But average turnout has dropped in each successive election. Now, voters in most countries do not seem to care about the European Parliament, despite the fact that its powers have been significantly increased in recent years. Indeed, the approval of the people's elected representatives is required to adopt new laws and policies in the Union. This change seems to make the Union more democratic by providing for direct popular input into policy. However, the citizens of the EU are much less likely to support the greater integration of the Union or the addition of new member countries than are the elites in the EU countries. There is a clear gap in attitudes toward the EU between the elites and the citizens of each country. The leaders of the Union and of its member countries have recently become increasingly concerned about what they call the democratic deficit. They believe the disconnect between the Union and its citizens calls into question the democratic legitimacy of the European Union. The need for the Union to have democratic legitimacy in the eyes of its people is of great concern to the leadership of the Union and its member countries. Before a country can be considered for membership in the EU, it must first demonstrate that it has a working democratic government with free and fair elections and protections for the rights and freedoms of citizens. If people do not believe in the democratic legitimacy of the Union, its right to rule them comes into serious question. And the demand that member countries have fully democratic systems seems a great hypocrisy. More and more citizens in the member countries have become Eurosceptic, meaning they are skeptical of the Union, believing that integration weakens the nation state, and that the Union is too undemocratic and too bureaucratic. Euroscepticism is quite high in some countries, notably the United Kingdom and Hungary. And most countries of the Union have Eurosceptic political parties, which advocate getting out of the Union and regaining sovereign control over their own affairs. One such party is the United Kingdom Independence Party, founded in 1993. Britain's withdrawal from the EU is its primary focus, and it does quite well in elections of UK representatives to the European Parliament. It is ironic, of course, that the leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party holds a seat in the European Parliament. Recognizing the strong Eurosceptic sentiment among some UK citizens, Prime Minister Cameron has announced that his Conservative Party, if they win the 2015 general election, will schedule a referendum on UK membership in the EU. This referendum, should it occur, would be unprecedented. No country has ever held a referendum on leaving the EU, and if the referendum is held and the voters approve withdrawal, that too would be unprecedented. No country has ever left the EU. Rather, more countries keep clamoring to join. Democracy and elections, absolutely fascinating to me, and I hope a little interesting to all of you. But there is something else I want to talk about in this valedictory address as I say goodbye to Frances Marion and to all of you. Frances Marion has allowed me to pursue my love of politics, but it has also allowed me to do two other things. One was to participate in the creation of a program, a department, and a college, now university. And the other was to work closely with some of the greatest people in the world. When I arrived here in 1974, the college, which I have to admit that I still catch myself calling it, was in its infancy. Some programs had been established, but they needed to grow and develop from infancy to maturity. One of the greatest pleasures I had was working with Neil Thigpen, the founding chairman of the Department of Political Science and Geography, to develop and strengthen the political science program and to bring on board new political scientists, as the program was granted more positions by the administration. As a new faculty member, I began to join various committees and work closely with other faculty to develop the institution as a whole. I was very impressed with the quality and friendliness of everyone at Francis Marion, both faculty and staff. In those early days, we all knew one another, worked together on many tasks, and truly did feel like family, again, both faculty and staff. I got involved in student affairs and worked with many good people putting together student activities and concerts by popular music groups. I also got to know most of the custodial and maintenance staff, some of the greatest people I have known. As time has gone on, some of the people I loved and worked with have left Francis Marion. Some have retired, and some have died. Each death has felt like I lost a family member because we were family. Francis Marion has changed a lot in my 39 years here. Much of the change has been wonderful, because every institution needs to continue growing and developing if it is to remain relevant and vibrant. But the change I regret most is the loss of that sense that we were all a small group working together to build the institution. Today, there is less of that sense of family and less of that sense of creating and building something special together. That, I suppose, was inevitable as the institution grew in number of programs, faculty, and staff, and became increasingly bureaucratized. But I am extremely fortunate to have been present during the early years of the institution. The foundation laid then in those years is responsible for the quality and strength of the institution today. I would be remiss if I did not include in this valedictory one very special person whose contributions to this institution cannot be overstated. That person is none other than our beloved Bill Moran, for whom this address is named. I had the great good fortune to work with Bill from the day he arrived in 1978 until he departed in 1992 to become president of Lander University. I developed enormous respect for Dean Moran, as we called him in those days. His intelligence, scholarly work, administrative skill, and professionalism were superlative. In many ways, Bill Moran was a mentor to me. From him, I learned how to be a true professional. I will mention two events which deepened my respect for him and helped me become an academic professional. I served many years on the Academic Council, the forerunner to the current Academic Affairs Committee. In those days, the Academic Council was chaired by the Dean of the College and Vice President for Academic Affairs, Bill Moran's official title. Therefore, I and the other elected council members worked closely with Bill in considering proposals that would modify existing academic programs or create new ones. I usually found myself in agreement with the positions that Bill Moran took, but once found myself opposing him. It did not matter to him that I opposed him. His attitude toward me did not change in the least. I learned that we can still work together, that we must go on together, and in the future will likely find ourselves agreeing on other matters. That's what academic professionals do. They treat each other with respect, no matter on what side of the issue they find themselves. By the way, the rest of the Academic Council agreed with Bill on that particular issue, and I'm glad they did, because he was right and I was wrong. Without the help of Dean Moran, I could not have gotten through my stint as director of the self-study for reaccreditation in the mid-1980s. He had a great deal of experience with the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, and he knew what self-studies needed to be and do. I consulted with him every step of the way, and his help was invaluable. Without him, the college, as it was then, would not have moved through the reaccreditation process as smoothly and with so few problems. I personally grew to love Bill Moran and to value him highly as not just a professional, but as my dear friend. I end on a purely personal note. If it were not for Frances Marion, I would not have met my husband, Tom Tallon. I met Tom because he is the son of one of my colleagues from the early days. Bill Tallon, Tom's father, came to Frances Marion originally as registrar and assistant professor of political science. When I arrived, he had already left the registrar's office and was director of development. He held a master's degree in international relations from George Washington University and taught part-time in the political science program. If I had not come to Frances Marion and worked with Bill in the political science department, I would never have met Tom and married him. I got to know Tom because I decided after 6 years at Frances Marion that I needed to buy a house. So I asked Bill Tallon where his son worked, since I knew that Bill had a son who was a real estate broker. I knew that any son of Bill's must be a trustworthy and honest real estate agent. I called Tom. Through him, I bought my first house, and we began to go out together. Our first real date was on my birthday, a few weeks before I closed on the house. 3 months later, he asked me to marry him. And 3 years after that, I said yes. We have now been married for 29 years and will celebrate our 30th anniversary in November. So, thanks for everything, Frances Marion University. You and the people who work here have added so much to my life. Thank you.